Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I could ask you to finish helping yourself to breakfast, take a seat, and I'll ask the panelists to come up. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joelle Attinger, President of the European Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's meeting on the Busan Consensus. We have an extraordinarily well-informed panel, so I'm going to get out of their way very quickly. Mostly, I do want to thank Ambassador Danny Sepulveda. You were at the Institute 6 months ago, and now, having come back from Busan, we're particularly interested in your assessment of consensus, what it means, and what lies ahead. I also want to welcome Sally Shipman Wentworth, who is Vice President of Global Policy Development at the Internet Society, and also thank the Internet Society, who is live streaming this meeting. I also want to welcome and thank Marie Royce, who is Senior Director for International Affairs at Alcatel-Lucent, Leslie Martinkovich, who is Director of International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Verizon Communications, and Andrea Glorioso, who many of you know, who is Counselor and heads the Digital Agenda and ICT at the Delegation of the European Union here in Washington. So now, without much further ado, I do want to thank Alcatel and Verizon for their engagement and support of the work of the European Institute, particularly in the digital and communications portfolio. And I also want to express our appreciation to the European Union and to the delegation, without whose support and engagement our conversation would be not as rich as it is today. So now I turn the podium over to Mike Nelson, who many of you know, who will be moderating this discussion. And Mike is Adjunct Professor for Internet Studies and Communications, Culture, and Technology at Georgetown University. Thank you all and welcome again.
Thank you very much, Joelle. I do think we have an incredibly qualified panel. This is not the first session on what happened in Busan, but I think it's going to be the best. This has been a really interesting few months. The meeting in Busan was the Plenipotentiary meeting of the International Telecommunications Union, the oldest agency of the UN. It's actually more than 80 years older than the UN itself, and next year we'll be celebrating its 150th anniversary. Of course, when it started, it was the International Telegraph Union, and it's evolved over time, but it is still the focal point for telecommunications policy, internet policy at the United Nations, and the meeting in Busan was incredibly important. So I'm very glad that the European Institute is holding this meeting, and that we have such a great audience, a lot of familiar faces and some less familiar faces here to ask questions about what went on. This really has been an important year for the ITU and for telecom policy, because it really was, in many ways, the year that these issues went up to a new level. When I first got involved in internet policy in 1988, this was kind of a $1 million question. Nobody showed up for the meetings that we held on the Hill. Over time, it became $1 billion issue. Today, the internet is a $100 billion, even $1 trillion issue. The issues that we're talking about affect all industries. And we saw that in Busan, where now these issues are getting linked to everything else: the global economy, geopolitics, national security. So I'm going to turn over first to our first speaker, Ambassador Daniel Sepulveda. He's first because he was the chairman of the delegation, the head of the delegation from the U.S. to Busan, and also somebody who's, for more than a year, been preparing the U.S. government's position for the meeting for the ITU Plenipotentiary. Ambassador Sepulveda is the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy at the U.S. Department of State. I just like to think of him as our ambassador to cyberspace. Prior to joining the Department of State, the ambassador showed that he had learned the two fundamental rules of succeeding in Washington. Rule 1, be really smart. Rule 2, find the right bosses to work for. So when he worked in the Senate, he worked for Barbara Boxer, Senator Barack Obama, and Senator John Kerry. And he did a great job for them, and they've put him in a position where he can do a great job for the U.S. government. So, Ambassador Sepulveda.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be quick. I'd really rather engage in a back and forth on this stuff. Returning to first principles, the mission of my organization and our mission on this delegation and in Busan is to try to create a global regulatory, legal, and policy environment that ensures the preservation of what is good about the internet. And what is the miracle of the internet? The miracle of the internet, which isn't a miracle, is man-made, is that any human being, or really any computing device, can, over a global network, communicate with any other computing device connected to that global network. That is an amazing thing. And what it enables as a matter of economics, social and cultural development, and human empowerment, the ability to challenge incumbent power, whether that's political incumbent power or corporate incumbent power or incumbent ideas that deserve to be challenged. That's the mission. The mission is to preserve that platform. So when I walk into a negotiating situation, the question is, how does the proposal on the table affect that prospect? Does it enhance it or does it diminish it? If it diminishes it, we will fight it. If it enhances it, we will support it. So the way that Busan works is you walk in and there is a base text. The base text is the Constitution and Conventions of the International Telecommunications Union, plus the resolutions of work. Every member state or every region can propose amendments to that base text. And just like any negotiation on the Hill, they have to win support to change the base text. So our proposition was to judge, and we participated in the Inter-American proposals, of which there were more than 40, that was united by our region across economic, social, and political lines in support of what the ITU could do that was good to further the mission as I defined it. There were proposals from other parts of the world that would have diminished the ability of human beings, if executed on, to act on the enabling capabilities that the internet provides for essentially commercial and human freedom. And those were predominantly out of the Arab, Russian, Chinese regions, out of autocratic states who would just have a fundamentally different philosophy about the relationship between the individual and the state and the individual and society. And we had to have it's incumbent upon them to convince us, all of us, because it's a consensus-based body, of a change to the authority of the organization to implement that goal. We were not willing to give that change. If the intent was to address what was a real issue, so in some cases there were cybersecurity proposals, in some cases there were proposals around ensuring that policymakers around the world had the skills necessary to create an enabling environment for investment. In some cases there were proposals for ensuring that there was a sharing of information on the best mechanisms for creating internet exchange points, and others. So there were two types of proposals that we were uncomfortable with. One in which the intent was to do something that we could simply not agree with, and in those we just had to isolate the argument and ensure it didn't grant consensus. And others in which the intent was not harmful, but the language was. And we negotiated out a mutually agreeable solution on that language. And as a result, what the Busan Consensus established is the containment of the authority of the ITU to very important things that enable human connectivity. What humans do with that connectivity is the job of other organizations. In some cases, particularly as it pertains to the actual operations of the internet, those organizations are multi-stakeholder organizations. ICANN, IETF, ISOC, the Internet Architecture Board, other standard, voluntary standard setting organizations. In other cases, questions that are not really questions of how does the internet operate, but what governing challenge does the internet carry with it? There are multiple different organizations in which those debates are taking place. UNESCO has debates on culture and the internet. The UN Human Rights Commission has debates on privacy and the internet. Many, many organizations, from regional organizations to private organizations to private public organizations, I think even the Renaissance Fair is going to have a conversation on how you deal with the governing challenges that the internet imposes on policymakers and societies. And that is just a fundamentally different question than who should centrally mandate or regulate a decentralized system that is decentralized in its organization and its execution, and it's voluntary. And it is because of those traits, those character traits, that you've enabled the power of the internet to make the world a better place. And at the end of the day, wherever there is true penetration of the internet, you have a support for that prospect. Europe, Australia, Japan, those parts of Latin America where there's significant penetration. Our first and primary goal is to connect people to the network. The network sells itself. Then we have to have other discussions in multiple avenues about what constitutes proper both market and personal behavior on those networks. And those are different questions. They're different environments, they're different sets of expertise. We are happy to engage in them. Our red line in Busan, and it's a red line that will remain, is that we won't allow the centralized regulation of technology. We won't allow the United Nations to tell people how to design their services. We won't allow the United Nations to tell people how to price their services. At the end of the day, we want everyone connected to the internet. We want them to be free to do whatever they wish within the bounds of human rights and the bounds of law on the internet. And we believe that if you maintain that sort of guiding light, that is the public service that is executed through these negotiations. So I think we were extremely successful in doing that in Busan. But Busan is not the end of a conversation. It was just a very important point in a long conversation, an interesting chapter in what will be a long book. And there are many more pages to follow. There will be other very interesting spaces of debate. And there are other points of view. Our colleagues from China, in particular, very much believe that there should be a special committee at the United Nations to tell the world what proper conduct is on the internet. And then the ITU, through its standard setting capacity and other organizations and law, should implement what they believe is proper conduct on the internet through standardization and law. Okay, we disagree. That's fine, that's okay. We can disagree agreeably, and we can have a public debate about why. We believe that would diminish everything that's good about the internet. And it's not necessary. So at the end of the day, we're going to continue having that debate. We're going to bring more and more people from around the world into the fold. We're going to unite our region on it. We're going to continue making the case and providing whatever assistance we can around the world to connect people to the network and to provide them with the skills to use that network. And we're going to continue working with people to make sure it's a safe and secure network and stable. And the people at this table are some of the most important people in that conversation. I consider everyone here an ally in that fight, and I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much also for distinguishing between efforts to shape the internet itself and the networks that make it up, control the services that run on the internet, and control the behavior of the people using those services. And that's been—
They're different buckets of public policy.
Completely. Our next speaker is Marie-Therese Royce. She leads the Alcatel-Lucent Americas region and has been very involved in these issues for many years. Both of us serve on the ACIP, the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Communications and Information Policy, which advises Ambassador Sepulveda. I won't read all of Marie's very impressive biography, but I will note that she has an MBA from Georgetown University.
Yay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you. I'm just going to say a few prepared remarks. But first, before I begin, I would like to thank the European Institute for inviting me to participate, and also say that I'm enjoying being on such a distinguished panel, so thank you. How many of you were actually in Busan? I know Jared Carlson. Okay, we've got raise the hands. Okay, terrific. Of course, our panelists here. I just want to say, can you imagine a world without the internet? And the ITU isn't the only risk facing the internet community. In addition to the Plenipot, there were several conferences in 2014 that presented challenges. And this is kind of amazing, but in China, the first annual World Internet Conference, conceived, hosted, and largely attended by the Chinese, happened last month. And of course, in Brazil, the Net Mundial initiative launched by the World Economic Forum, ICANN, and Ambassador Sepulveda led the US delegation. And in Turkey, the UN's Internet Governance Forum, the principal forum for global internet policy. Was the Busan consensus a turning point? I say yes. There seemed to be an underlying effort among all the delegations to heal the union following WICET 2012. Delegations worked hard to find compromise solutions among diverse proposals, and there was a strong effort to find a common path forward with the ITU under its newly elected leadership. And I'd like to thank the US delegation and individuals representing. And I went through the list, and from a private sector perspective, there were 40 people representing 40 different organizations. And I think that's incredibly commendable. In addition, I wasn't actually in Busan, but I was there from the very beginning, and it was a whole year of preparation. In fact, it was a one-year commitment with meetings, and I just revisited an email from my colleague, and I think this is really interesting. The email was dated August 7, 2013, and encouraged me to attend the first event. And it said the first prep meeting will take place September 10, 2013. The meeting will be led by the new ambassador, Danny Sepulveda, who was recently appointed to succeed Phil Favre. So I just want to commend you, Danny, because it's been now over a year, and look how much you've accomplished. So let's give you a big round of applause. So it is pretty amazing. So from a private sector standpoint, I wanted to share some brief comments from the US ITU Association, the ITI, which is our trade association for the technology companies, GSMA, and a few private sector delegates, for example, Jared, who was kind enough to share, and the appropriate role of governments in global internet policy. But from an overview standpoint, the member report states that there are a record-setting 2,505 delegates from 171 countries. The US delegation had 133 members. The key outcomes included elections, approval of the strategic and financial plans, and adoption of more than 51 resolutions, including 21 new resolutions. Ken Siletz from ITI, our trade association, said, "It's worthwhile to reflect on what is an unqualified success at the ITU meeting: dynamic leadership, great preparation, and a US delegation of 133 members who were very highly motivated." From a US perspective, we had an essential ingredient: the leadership of the State Department's Ambassador Danny Sepulveda and his deputy Julie Zoller, who each played a decisive role in steering PP-14 towards a soft landing. They didn't neglect our traditional allies. They traversed the Pacific and Atlantic numerous times to strategize with Europe, Japan, Korea, and Australia. These investments paid huge dividends in Busan and should continue to serve us as well as we pursue our campaign to maintain the highly successful multi-stakeholder approach to internet governments. And I'd like to point out the incredible role Danny and Julie had, and so did the delegation, in embracing CTEL, which is our America's partner. We had a high degree of cohesion and success throughout the conference. CTEL, which is in Latin America, brought 44 inter-American proposals to the conference, most of which were based on US proposals or included the US as a signatory. The US delegation strategy and dedicated efforts to forge regional consensus on key issues, and it should be replicated in the future. From a GSMA standpoint, they noted that the outcomes were very positive for the mobile industry and that all potentially harmful proposals were either withdrawn entirely or resolved satisfactorily with text. These included proposals such as IP traffic routing, charges for international numbering resources, and electromagnetic fields. But there was only one exception, a last-minute text edition on counterfeit devices, which might impact mobile manufacturers and which will be brought to the next study group level. And then I spoke to Jared from Ericsson, and I want to thank him for his feedback. He observed two groups of problematic proposals. Those were, one is a group which he states where the IT wants to step in where it really isn't wanted, which is in the areas of internet regulation, EMF safety, cybersecurity, and conformance and interoperability testing. And a few proposals were seemingly innocuous, which could have led to more ITU involvement. The Republic of South Korea proposed 2 new resolutions that would involve the ITU in the Internet of Things, and they wanted to set aside specific spectrum and in the area of convergence and applications. But in the end, we ended up with a fairly generic statement. And there was proposals to try to generate money for the ITU. There was a number of proposals in that. The best example of this is the proposal to charge for international numbering resources, essentially having the ITU extract payments for handing out various INRs. It also came up in the context of a proposal about mobile phone theft. In order to track mobile phone theft, you need a database, right? Can anyone guess who was going to build the database? Okay, and presumably charge money for this? Okay, yes, you got it. Okay, so now one of the other comments is that from Alcatel-Lucent's perspective, we were very pleased that Bell Labs and Lucent alumna Joanne Wilson was elected to the Radio Regulations Board election Region A. She was originally from our company, and so we're very excited. She was one of the 2 delegates to be elected to that. And also I wanted to point out something that happened at Busan that has never happened before. UN Women got involved. They celebrated the power of technology to transform women's lives, and they presented the first ever Gender Equality Mainstream Technology Gem Tech Awards. And here's the background behind it. There are 200 million fewer women online compared to men. Without remedial action, it's estimated that the internet gender gap could grow to 350 million within 3 or 4 years. And so I'm proud to state that Alcatel-Lucent was one of the 6 award recipients. We won for Strong Her Initiative as one of 6 Gemtech Global Achievers for our work with, inside of our company, we have people connected in 51 countries as a platform for, and we actually have 18% of the people are men, and it's a best practices example. In addition to that, GSMA Connected Women won, Gina Davis, Jasna Matic from Serbia, and individuals from Cisco and Intel Corporation. The awards were given out in front of 2,500 delegates by Secretary Tory. So in conclusion, the Plenipot Conference had great cooperation in the census, and I want to say thank you to the U.S. delegation led by Ambassador Sepulveda for your leadership. The Busan Consensus was a turning point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you so much for giving us the full context. Many people heard that this was a 3-week meeting and thought, well, what all did they do? She gave you just a little sense of all the different issues that were on the table and all the different programs. Next, I'd like to turn to Sally Shipman Wentworth. I've known her for more than 10 years, since she was working in the State Department in the office that Danny now heads. She's currently at the Internet Society, where she is Vice President for Global Policy Development, and she's a key player working with people around the world on Internet policy issues.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to the European Institute for organizing this discussion. For those of you who don't know the Internet Society, we are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to a view that the Internet should be for everyone. We are advocates for an open, global, interoperable network of networks around the world. And we are also the home of the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is one of the key internet standards development organizations in the world that develop many of the core standards that you use every day when you go online. So we approach issues of internet governance from a vantage point of this intersection between policy, technology, and development. We really do believe that the internet empowers people, and we want to see more connectivity, more deployment of the technology around the world. And so our focus when we come to events like the Plenipotentiary Conference, but more broadly as well, is what does that environment look like that would enable the internet to be deployed in more countries for more people for the benefit of people everywhere. We truly do believe that the next billion that come online will change the future of the internet, and we want to enable that growth and that innovation to happen. And so the public policy environment in which that happens, of course, is very important. It's very important at the local level. It's very important at the regional level in terms of cooperation, cross-border exchange, and the like. And it's also very important at the global level. What is the global policy context in which the internet can flourish? So meetings like the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference take place in that broader context of a global dialogue that the previous two speakers have both referred to, this ongoing discussion of what is the role of government, what is the role of international organizations like the ITU in bringing the internet or bringing communications about to the entire world. We truly believe that the internet and its governance is really an ecosystem. It is comprised of many different stakeholders, many different organizations whose work is often interrelated, and in that interrelation we create value for the global network. So as we approach the Plenipotentiary Conference, we at the Internet Society came in with a very strong view that the ITU needs to see itself as part of that broader ecosystem. Rather than approaching this from a perspective of control or centralization, really look at the role that the ITU can play within its existing mandate to bring about greater connectivity, more infrastructure, and the things that it does well within that broader group of organizations. And we were, I think, we were all wondering, as many were, as to whether the discussion in Busan would be similar to what we had seen in Dubai 2 years earlier. It was a very divisive conversation for, I think, a host of very good reasons, fundamental disagreements on the regulatory environment for the internet. But whether that divisiveness would carry into the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference was a real open question, I think, as we were going in. And as the ambassador said, many organizations and many governments had spent a lot of time and a lot of effort over the last 2 years to try to build bridges where they could be built, keep the dialogue open. And I do think we saw the benefits of that approach in Busan. It was pretty clear that governments came to this meeting with a desire to mend the bridges and in some ways maybe repair the union as it takes on new leadership and the next 4-year strategic plan. So I think that was all extremely positive. Having said that, I mean, we shouldn't deny that there were very difficult issues that countries were dealing with and proposals that came in. I should say that Internet Society was a sector member of the conference, so we were able to attend, able to be in the room, able to see all the proposals, all the documents, but we don't have a speaking role in this environment. We aren't a negotiator. This is a treaty organization. But the fact that we were able to observe and really and be at least in the room, I think is actually an important step forward. And the ITU did make some important steps in terms of webcasting the main meetings and also making documentation for the conference more widely available to even those who didn't have accounts or registered user abilities. So I think those were good steps forward in terms of transparency for the ITU, and hopefully we can see more of that going forward. There were hard issues. Countries, as I said, are still wondering what should their role be, and how to execute on that, and how to execute on it in the context of the ITU. And as the ambassador pointed out, there's pretty strong differences of opinion. And I think the fact that that the meeting reached consensus suggests not that those differences of opinion have gone away, but rather that countries decided not to allow those differences to be a stumbling block to a consensus outcome. And so there were efforts to find language that people could agree to, and maybe, to use an American phrase, kick the ball down the road one more time. We did find, though, that there were areas that, frankly, I was surprised. 4 years ago in the ITU, it was very difficult to get internet organizations even recognized in the texts, in the resolutions. It was a fight. Countries weren't comfortable with this idea that there were other relevant organizations in the internet ecosystem that might have a role to play. This time around, there's actually quite a bit of language, if you go through the various resolutions, that talks about cooperation, that talks about working with other organizations, that even references some of the internet organizations. We're still in a footnote, but we're there, and it wasn't a fight. And I think that actually says something about perhaps the future and how and something that was important to us, that the ITU really looked to work in a more cooperative and a more transparent way as part of a broader set of organizations that have, in some cases, some shared objectives. We still have an ongoing discussion, I think, though, that will happen. It will happen in the ITU. It moves now, I think, more generally into the United Nations, into the General Assembly in New York in the coming year. So these issues haven't gone away. But I do think the outcome was one reached by consensus, which is a good thing. There are still going to be challenges in how the ITU addresses internet public policy matters, whether those of us who aren't member states can be part of that discussion, and how those discussions will factor into future recommendations and other outputs of the ITU. So this is, as the internet continues to be more and more important to countries and governments around the world, it's not surprising that these discussions come up. But it is an ongoing challenge that I think we have to keep paying attention to.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you very much for focusing a bit on the procedures and the processes, because I think some of the most important developments were that the process was made more transparent and more multi-stakeholder. Now I'll turn to Leslie Martinkovich, who's the Director for International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Verizon Communications. Leslie has been at Verizon for about 15 years. He is the institutional memory among those of us who worry about ITU issues. He knows all the stories, where all the skeletons are buried in Geneva, is on a first-name basis with all the people who really matter at the ITU. And so I look forward to hearing your perspectives on Busan.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. I think, no, thank you very much, and thank you to the European Institute for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning. Thinking of my comments for today, I was thinking back of all the concerns that we had going into this plenipotentiary, and while I may not be the institutional memory on these issues, this was my fourth plenipotentiary, and I have to say that of all of these conferences, this was, I think, the best led with Ambassador Sepulveda and with Julie Zoller. It was the best prepared. The time that we spent getting ready for this meeting, preparing our documentation, our positions, getting our facts straight, came in enormously helpful. Because when you get to these meetings, it can be very slow moving, can be dull, but then they'll turn in a moment. And then you're moving very, very fast. And you're dealing with a number of different issues, different rooms, different hours. It could be the morning, it could be late at night, so you have to have your facts ready. and the delegation had its facts ready, and I think it really, really accounted for a successful meeting from our perspective. Another reason why I think it was successful is because the outgoing leadership, Secretary General Toure, wanted to make sure we had a successful conference. This was his last meeting before he leaves his post after 8 years as Secretary General and 8 years as the Director of the Development Sector, 16 years at the ITU. The new leadership coming in also wanted to ensure that we had a successful meeting to get their foot on the ground in a very positive way going forward. The government of Korea wanted to make sure that we had a very successful meeting. They wanted to showcase their high technology, their abilities, their priorities, their equipment. All of these, I think, added to the success. Governments also, I think, were relatively happy with the work program that came out of this meeting. And I'll get to that in a moment. But I think that was an important part of why this was a success. Also, as I talk with governments at this session, 3 weeks is a long time, so you have time to chat with folks informally that you've known for years and years. There's a sense that also that this was a special meeting, that there are so many critical moving pieces in front of us now for next year and the year after. And governments are very interested in seeing how these moving pieces will fall into place and what role they will have going forward. Because make no mistake, there is still a very strong desire on the part of many governments around the world to have a greater say on internet governance issues, on internet resources. So they're paying very keen attention to how the Internet Governance Forum will go in Brazil in 2015. Will the IGF change its format somewhat? What will happen to the Net Mundial initiative? How will the discussions go in Davos, in WEF in January? And very importantly, how will the review of the World Summit on Information Society go in 2015 to be capped by an important meeting in New York in December of next year? And as mentioned earlier, this now puts us on a different track. It moves us out of Geneva, the ITU, and puts us squarely in New York, where, of course, the environment is very different, and we'll be challenged as a member of industry to monitor what is going on and how those discussions will go forward. But clearly, the WSIS review process will be very, very important for us. It will be very important for the ITU, and that was stated so much by the new Secretary General. It's a key issue for the ITU going forward. So we will be working very closely with Ambassador Sepulveda, his staff, colleagues at the FCC, at NTIA, Homeland Security, and beyond in tackling these issues going forward. So all in all, very positive. Looking forward to working with all of the participants that were there going forward. However, there will be challenges, and those of us that work inside the ITU day in and day out, when the lights get turned off and you go back to work, we will have challenges, we will have issues, and Marie raised some of these issues, and we agree with her completely. For example, there was a meeting that just concluded in Kuwait City, which was a regional meeting of the Arab Group, preparing for the upcoming Study Group 3, which is the group in the ITU that deals with tariffing and charging issues. They're going to be bringing in a host of what I would call relatively new issues for study and to move it forward. OTT, Internet of Things, M2M, privacy. These are all issues that are, have been on the radar screen within the ITU, but I would call them powered up issues. They're going to be taken up and we'll be working on them. The Council Working Group on the Internet is going to be a key group. The working groups will meet in late January, so we'll be watching those very carefully. The India resolution was highlighted, that there are some challenges from that. on routing that I believe will be coming back again through other sources and maybe other governments. It's an extraordinarily important issue for many governments for security reasons and other reasons as well. So we'll see them again. And of course, the budgetary challenges of the ITU, as was noted. As somebody who pays a lot of money to be part of the ITU, to be able to go to all three sectors, we will be watching very carefully the new leadership of the ITU as they meet probably in the first quarter of next year to think of ways to raise revenue, to fill the budgetary holes as developing countries continuously come to the ITU for more requests, for more work, for more tutorials, for more assistance in technologies, et cetera. So we will all watch that very, very carefully going forward. And finally, we have to watch very carefully also areas that will evolve from the white papers of the past and guidance, very much voluntary issues in the development sector where we've worked for many, many years on cybersecurity and other issues. But one very, very quick example of how things are changing in this regard is that internet exchange points, which are really critical, and ISOC has been very much involved in working on internet exchange points all over the world and extremely successfully. This issue was also discussed for a number of years in the development sector. A number of governments, however, would like to move this work into the telecom sector to fashion recommendations around them, which they feel will have a little bit more teeth, a little bit more of ability to mold and shape how these important technologies evolve going forward. So we'll have to watch that carefully as well. So all in all, I say it was a very successful meeting. It was, I think, really a different tone than we had in the past. And we'll just have to watch and work within the existing structure with all of our friends and colleagues and try to ensure that the ITU remains within its mandate, which was not changed at this meeting, and go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Now I want to turn to our final speaker, Andrea Glorioso, who has been here in Washington for less than a year. He's the counselor for ICT and digital economy at the delegation of the European Union. However, he's not new to these issues. For 6 years, he's been working in Brussels at the European Commission on cybersecurity, digital privacy, human rights, and internet governance. He's already made quite an impression here in Washington, been on lots of panels, and I follow him religiously on Facebook. Those of you who want to know what's going on internet governance and see the latest thinking from Brussels on these issues should definitely follow Andrea. So look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Michael, and you're of course all very welcome to follow me on Facebook or on Twitter. You will also get photos of my kids from time to time, so just warn about that. And thank you very much to the European Institute for having me here. I'm not going to repeat what has already been said about the results of the ITU. We, European members of the ITU, are broadly satisfied with the results. It is important to underline, as others have done, as the other speakers have done, we didn't get there by chance. There was a lot of preparation to obtain these results, these achievements. I completely share, would like to join other speakers to congratulate the US team and especially Ambassador Sepulveda for the great preparatory work that was done, which I can tell you from the other side of the ocean, it was felt, especially compared to WICIT, to the World Conference on International Telecommunication in 2012. We like to think that European countries, also European members of the ITU, also helped with the preparation for a good result of the Plenipotentiary. And perhaps one way in which we helped, we did really make an effort to reach out to governments which are closer to us geographically and for historical reasons. And this, I think, is important to mention. It's a point on which I would like to return during my, I will try to do a brief intervention even though I'm Italian, but I really rely on you, Mike, to hit me if I go beyond my time. This is a point on which I would like to return, but in terms of the preparation to the plenipotentiary, I believe that European countries and the US were really complementary. Each reached out, each worked with their neighboring countries, and again, this is something which we should keep in mind for the years to come. Now, without wanting to repeat, since I do not want to repeat what has already been said, which is the privilege of the last speaker, I'd like to have perhaps a slightly broader view on what happened in Busan, and especially on what we should work on for after Busan. And the basic point, I believe, is that we should all remember that the internet as a technology, and especially the societal effects, the political effects, the economic effects of the internet, is a very young technology. And we all, whether we are governments, private sector, civil society, academia, you name them, we're all still grappling on what to do with this technology, which has changed certain dynamics and certain balances of power that have been existing for a very long time. I'm saying this because I guess that even when we discuss with governments or counterparts which are very far away from our positions, we should keep in mind that, in my view, they are also grappling with the same question that we are grappling with. What do we do with this? And if we recognize that, then we can also have a better dialogue, because we can try to work together to find mutually satisfactory solution, rather than assume that we have the final solution to everything, which we have our ideas. I mean, the US has its own view on how the internet should develop. Europe has its own view. I think the US and European views are broadly, if not almost overlapping, I would say. But the point is that if we go into dialogue assuming that we always have the right answer, that creates tension in the dialogue. As anyone who has ever had any kind of discussion knows, you need to start from the assumption that the counterpart maybe also has a point, has a problem, and the point of a dialogue is trying to find a solution, a common solution to those problems. I think it's very fitting that we're having this meeting in a room where, and I'm sorry that the people who are following this from via the webcast cannot see it, where there is that exhibition on survival. And I think that up until now, survival is a very important concept. I mean, I like to survive, of course, we all like to survive, that's in human nature. I think that up until now, a lot of the approaches, both in the US and in Europe, from industry, from the governments, have been focusing a bit too much on survival, on resisting changes that we are afraid of, sometimes for very good reasons, to be absolutely clear, and I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. There have been proposals, both at the Plenipotentiary and other settings, from other parts of the world, which Europe completely disagrees with. We think that it would be extremely not beneficial for the evolution of the internet and for all the good effects that the internet can bring. But however, having said that, focusing exclusively on survival is a very conservative attitude. And what we should focus on, in my view, much more is on evolution. And evolution is another key, is what makes us what we are as human beings. And of course, evolution is, you cannot direct evolution, you cannot tell organisms what to do top down, even though Europe sometimes we might like to do it. We are perhaps slightly a bit more top down than here in the US, but jokes aside, we really need to focus on what the future holds and being open-minded. Things might be different than what they are now. Now, the point is that, of course, we do not want those things to be completely different from what our core beliefs and our core values are, what we believe is right. But be it as it may, there is a saying, I'm paraphrasing a saying of an ancient Latin poet, and I think as an Italian I'm allowed to quote ancient Latin poets. The wind, and this is not the precise saying, but I'm paraphrasing, that the wind is always favorable to the ships which know where they're going. So we have to have a clear idea where we are going, and I believe that that idea should be in common between the US and Europe, and I think to a large extent it already is. But most importantly, we had to realize that because the internet is so complex, and that complexity has multiple dimensions. The internet is complex because it touches upon so many policy areas. I mean, if you think nowadays of any policy area that is discussed in government or elsewhere, taxation, privacy, cybersecurity, human rights, I'm loath to use the term industrial policy. I know that in this country it's a very, very dangerous term to use, but interpret it as you want. The internet has touched upon these policy areas, it has changed them. So the complexity derives from the fact that if you want to do internet policy, you need to follow all of these topics in parallel. It's also complex from an institutional point of view because, as it has been very well said by other speakers, there are many different organizations that deal with all these issues. What is the consequence of this? The consequence is that, in our view, and I think this, frankly, we have underestimated this problem for a very long time. If you're a country with not many resources, from a financial point of view, from a human point of view, it can be very daunting to follow all of this. Now, I think it's a normal human reaction that when you are faced with complexity and you do not have the resources to cope with that complexity, but at the same time you realize that the internet is strategic for your country, you might end up accepting advice from organizations or other countries which simply come to you and tell you, you don't need to worry, here is the position you have to take. And that happens all the time, and perhaps we have been in the past also a bit guilty of that. So the reason I'm saying this is that whatever happened in Busan and whatever will happen in the future, we need to focus a lot more on capacity building. We need to focus a lot more on going to other countries out there. And here again, the US has its own relationship with Latin America, Southern America. I don't mean to mention Canada because I'm sure Canada has very good capabilities from that point of view. Europe has its eastern neighbors, very good relationship with African countries, and all these governments, all the organizations, private or public in these countries, they are eager to have a discussion. They're eager to work together, and they're eager to have more resources to follow these issues. We have to be very careful because if we do not do that, others will do it. And as a matter of fact, they are already doing it. I do not want to name names. I have a diplomatic ID card, so I'm technically a diplomat for the 4 years that we stay here. I'm told I'm not very diplomatic, and I'm really making an effort to do that, so I will not name names. But there are countries out there which are already engaging very actively with their neighbors, and they're doing it advancing their own ideas and their own interests, which are not compatible with ours. So we had to work a lot more on that. I'm happy to say that just recently the European Commission is on the point, it should happen in a few days, of signing a contract to launch a platform which is called the Global Internet Policy Observatory. I'm happy to give more details on that, but the idea is to have an online platform which, using big data technology, would allow users, especially from developing countries, to monitor and understand better what's happening in the different fora in which internet decisions and debates are taking place. A very last point, if you allow me, Mike, and this is a point on which I said I would return. For us, especially for me as a counselor of the European Union here in the US, but I feel for Europe as a whole, it is very important that we keep in mind that what we have in common between Europe and the US is a lot more than what divides us, especially if we compare ourselves with certain countries, again, which I'm not going to name, out there. And in the past, not only in the ATU context, but also in other discussions, I think that we might have all made a collective mistake of focusing a bit too much on those small differences that divide us, and this has been used, and it will be used by other countries and other organizations to drive a wedge between us. We will continue to have differences. We do not always agree, but I believe that those differences, especially when it comes to internet policies, are ultimately quite small. And it's much better that we work together to show leadership, if I may say so, and to set a good example to other countries which are in the middle right now. They have not yet decided in which direction they want to go. And frankly, I don't think that, if you see Europe and US quarreling with each other, we are not setting a good example. We are not providing leadership to other countries which are looking at us and are trying to understand, okay, should we go that way? Should we go the open and multi-stakeholder way? Or should we listen to, again, unnamed countries out there which seem to be a lot more united in their front opposing the multi-stakeholder model and the open internet, etc. And this is something which is very, very important to me as a counselor here, for the European delegation in particular. Let us not focus on our differences. Let's focus on what we have in common. This is what we did for Busan, for the ATU Plenipotentiary, and I would say that the results in the end were worth the effort, which is an effort because we do have our differences and we like to fight from time to time, but maybe we should fight more, a little bit more in closed rooms, or maybe we could learn American football and you could learn soccer, and we could solve our differences on the playing field rather than in other settings.
Thank you very much. I'm actually very proud to say that I am a letterman in soccer.
Okay.
From Caltech, which is like having a PhD in literature from the National Football League. Thank you very much for putting us in a transatlantic context here. Before turning it over to the audience and to our viewers online for questions, I did want to ask a couple questions and drill down to one case study that several of you mentioned. There was this Indian proposal that came up, which I think was really emblematic of the fight that's going on. It was something that came up at the last minute, which is always what you worry about when you're part of a delegation, because you can't be prepared for everything. This proposal was put forward by the Indian government, and the idea was to allocate internet protocol addresses by nation, so that rather than having a global network where you could have a device that would work everywhere, you would actually get a internet protocol address from your own government, or that would be for your country. Now, most countries would work together and these devices would work globally, but by allocating these addresses by country, it would be much easier to censor the internet, it would be much easier to monitor the internet, and it would give governments more control over the internet. Well, needless to say, the internet technical community, the governments represented here, the businesses represented here, and lots of other people were quite alarmed by this proposal. But there were some supporters, and India is a big country, it has lots of allies. So I guess my question for the panelists, a couple questions. Why did the Indians do this? What were they really up to? And why were we able to push back effectively? Because this is not the first time we've seen this kind of proposal to subdivide the internet and to give governments more control. There was no vote on this proposal, which is unusual. There were no votes in 3 weeks at Busan other than the votes for the elections. So none of the really thorny policy issues came to a debate. So I'd like to just delve a little deeper into this India proposal and see what we can learn about that episode. Leslie, do you want to
Sure, happy to
be our
start.
process wonk?
Okay. Well, certainly from my perspective, it was a proposal that did give us a lot of concern. As Michael said, it arrived late into the meeting. When we did see it, we spoke with others within our own delegation. We discussed it within the delegation. Ambassador Sepulveda was very much aware and had important discussions with colleagues from India and beyond. His leadership on this issue was critical. But from my perspective as a company in the room, it did concern us greatly whenever we hear of governments that are pushing for data localization requirements, keeping data within countries. I think partially maybe to answer your question, Michael, why did India do this? India has had for some time a focus, a relatively strong focus on security issues, and to be able to monitor internal networks within the country. If you recall back, there was an episode, I think a couple years back, with BlackBerry, when BlackBerry had some very difficult discussions with the government of India and the Indian government requirements to be able to monitor those communications. So I think a part of it is a legitimate concern with security issues. However, our concern was that while that may be the case, when you start to potentially interfere with routing of the IP networks, traceability, internal monitoring, NMI, these are all very difficult issues, and from our perspective could cause significant problems. And we worked very closely with the delegation and with others to try to explain this to our colleagues from India. Again, like I said before, very briefly, I don't think these issues will go away. I think the issues will stay with us. It's all a part of efforts for certain governments to exert more control over communications within their own countries, as well as, of course, financial issues and economic issues to be able to better understand and monitor these bits and going through various networks in and out of their countries. So I think it's part of the process, part of the answer, and continues to be a challenge.
I'd like to speak to this a little bit. I was the one who engaged in direct negotiations with our colleague from India. What I can say is we spent many hours having conversations. And in the first instance, I think India and Brazil are probably the two most important countries in this discussion, in the sense that, one, they're working very hard at it. They've put very serious people on the task, and they very much are not only open to engagement, they want engagement. They want a discussion, they want a negotiation, they want a debate. My colleague from India at Busan was extremely honorable and sincere in his interest. And what I understood his interest to be was that they have a security challenge in India. That when when, for example, a cyber attack is executed, but even not a cyber attack, just a regular everyday crime that uses technology to execute the crime, they don't have a capacity to trace that communication. They don't have a capacity to find who the individual was who engaged in that communication, and they don't have a capacity to punish it. This is a truly central governing challenge. And our argument to my colleague from India was, obviously, the United States does not support crime. The ITU itself, however, is not a law enforcement agency. And the use and manipulation of technology to get at behavior is always both tricky and carries costs. At the end of the day, what we would appreciate is a focus on addressing behavior rather than technology, regulating behavior rather than technology because of the associated costs. So for example, part of the proposal was to ensure that any communication that originated within a nation and terminated within that nation stay within the nation. If that communication is most efficient doing that, no problem. Sure. If it drives investment, innovation, and you build internet exchange points and you have a competitive market, and for reasons of reduced latency and other reasons you want that communication makes logical sense to stay in the country, no problem. But if you want to impose a centralized standard to make that happen in order to achieve the containment of a very specific and small amount of information for law enforcement purposes, in the first instance, the identification of what the risk is and the expertise necessary to assess whether or not that risk is and its associated costs are comparable to the costs that you're imposing to achieve the means is not to happen at the ITU. There are law enforcement officials. There's a UN office on drugs and crime. There are a whole host of different bilateral mechanisms by which you have these conversations. There are a whole host of different evidence sharing mechanisms by which law enforcement officials work with each other. And he as a communications official and myself as a communications official are not the right people to have that conversation. What I do know as a communications official is that those proposals would do real damage to how the internet operates and the capacity of people to use it and the costs imposed on them in using it in order, from my perspective, to achieve a minority end, numerically, percentage-wise, of the overall good being perpetrated. So we had many, and that's a very short summary of multiple hours of fairly, sometimes loud conversation, but always respectful. At no point did I believe that my Indian counterpart was trying to manipulate law and regulation to benefit Indian commerce, or was trying to manipulate law and regulation with any intent other than to preserve the public interest. On that basis, I can work with you. I mean, there are multiple places where we can work together. They're actually coming in January to have our annual bilat, and I will be welcoming them, and we will be working across the whole of government to bring other officials into the conversation to try to address some of these thornier issues. But at the end of the day, what worked in that conversation was, one, having a conversation, two, not objecting to him making the proposal and making his case, but making it quite clear that we were going to make the counter-argument. And letting him know exactly what that counter-argument was going to be. Not disrespectfully, just this is a statement of our point of view. That was a statement of their point of view. And once he aired his statement of his point of view, I aired my statement of point of view, others jumped in. And it was the sense of the room that it was a bad idea. Not that it was a bad intent, but it was a bad idea. And that the location wasn't right. Once you establish those 2 points, you didn't have consensus for movement. But he had a fair hearing, and he deserved a fair hearing. And I think that one of the challenges that we've had in previous negotiations and discussions on this topic is that there are ideas that don't deserve a hearing. That's just not true. There are bad ideas, but even bad ideas deserve a hearing, and they deserve a negotiation, and they deserve a debate. And we're bringing that debate and discussion and negotiation. And we also have to bring alternative solutions, because cybersecurity threats aren't made up, they exist, they're real. There are criminals in the world, there are bad people in the world, and they're using technology to effectuate their ends. We have to address that. Using standards and the regulation of technology to do so is not the right way to do it. That does not mean it's not a problem. And so we're working through multiple mechanisms to try to address those challenges in cooperation and coordination with our colleagues, not just in India, but in Brazil and some of the other key markets around the world, who have real leadership positions within the developing world on where public opinion goes and where public policy making goes. For all the challenges it imposes, having 3 billion people on an interoperable network requires some degree of cooperation and collaboration, and it requires discussion, and that's okay. What I'm learning a lot from many of these discussions is that the ecosystem that Sally describes is incredibly complex, and to many seems chaotic because it's complex. Much like a rainforest is incredibly complex, but it is not chaotic. There is a balance. And understanding that balance and understanding where you can prioritize, where you inject yourself is critically important, that having policymakers and leaders in industry, civil society, and elsewhere around the world feel like this is a system that is fair. And they have a right to call for a fair system, right? And that's making sure that the system evolves and becomes sufficiently inclusive and is transparently fair as a matter of participation in the airing of ideas and the debate of ideas and the crucible of debate is really what I think is the key to bringing, in the first instance, leaders who are cynical or skeptical of our intentions. And it's just a long haul, but you have to do it, and at the end of the day, it has to be in the public global interest, right? And why I think we were successful, why were we able to manage 130 people in one delegation, is because we had a common mission. It's not a series of conjoined special interests trying to achieve a mutual interest. It is a movement, and the movement is to empower individuals at the edge of the network to fulfill whatever potential and goal they wish to fulfill, obviously within the constructs of universal human rights and the law. Once you understand the mission, everyone can move in the same direction.
Very good. So it's a rainforest mission, as opposed to
Preserve the rainforest.
yes,
Save
preserve
the
the
rainforest.
rainforest,
Michael,
as
can I-
opposed to creating a French garden that's perfectly sculpted and totally planned and doesn't ever change. I think Andrea had.
I will gladly give the floor.
Okay.
Oh, I just was going to
Follow
make
up.
one comment in that I agree with what your ambassador is saying, and that the Indians are very sincere in their concerns about cybersecurity, and that I participated about a month ago when 20 people in the delegation came to NIST to actually learn about best practices and the evolution of standards, the voluntary framework. So this is, as you said, an area that they are really focused on.
Well, I'm glad that people more diplomatic than I were speaking to the Indians, because I think I would have been a techie and I would have just said, now, do you really want a committee with 180 country representatives designing an internet that 2 billion people use so you can catch a couple hundred people? I mean, that doesn't quite make sense.
He would have said yes.
And then I would have gotten rude and I would have said, where's your badge and where's your gun? Andrea.
Thank you. Just to add on what Ambassador Sepulveda said, which we agree with, yes, the ITU was probably not, arguably, not the right place where to have this sort of discussion, which, however, is an important discussion. Security, whether it's cybersecurity or national security, intelligence activities, they are important to the Indians as they are important to every other single country in the world, including, and we have to be very clear and honest about it, including our own countries. That is an important concern for all of us. Mm-hmm. One point on which I'm not sure I agree with Ambassador Sepulveda, or maybe to be diplomatic I might have misunderstood, is on the issue of regulating technology. And the issue is not regulating technology. The issue is the impact that certain types of technology have on human behavior, or on the way in which regulating that human behavior becomes easier and harder. And by regulating human behavior, I also mean prosecuting cyber criminals, for example. Now, let me give you a very simple example, which is lawful intercept, which is the technical ability or the technical characteristic of certain network equipment devices to let law enforcement authorities access the stream of data. And that is usually, well, depending on the country, is done under judicial order, or it depends, but it is a core capability that law enforcement agencies need to have in order to investigate and prosecute crime. Now, in order to achieve that, you need your devices, you need your equipment to be designed in a certain way. Now, whether you do that through an ITU standard, or whether you do it through a bottom-up standardization process, or you do it in any other way, that is an important question. But I think that it's the kind of buckets that were described before between the core networks, the services, and the behavior. it's a very useful metaphor, I would say. It's a very useful, more than a metaphor, it's a very useful conceptual instrument to address these issues, but you cannot really divide so completely these layers, because the decision, the way in which the technology is designed has an impact on how you can, as a society, on how we can handle societal behaviors, which quite frankly we don't like, and there are very good reasons why we don't like. So I'm saying this only because I believe that this is an important conversation that we should have. And I also believe that it would be much better if we had that conversation between the EU and the US and we showed leadership to the rest of the world, because other parts of the world and the famous unnamed countries, which I will continue not to name, they are already designing technology for specific societal purposes, and the way they are designing the technology is not the way in which we would do it. So we have to, I believe that we would better place to face those countries and to discuss those countries if we accept the notion that yes, there is a relationship between the way in which the technology operates and the way in which society operates. And again, that's a dialogue that I really think, and speaking as a counselor of the delegation, I would be very happy to facilitate, to facilitate that between our technology and our policymakers, and also with other organizations. I mean, ISOC works very closely with the Internet Engineering Task Force on this IETF policy program, through which policy officials participate in the IETF meetings, which tend to be very technical, in order to understand better how IETF discussions go, how technology is actually designed. And I like to think that that is also useful for the technologists that work in the internet or with or within the Internet Engineering Task Force to understand what are the concerns and what are the priorities of policymakers. So there has to be a kind of mutual relationship between these two worlds.
Well, thank you very much. You hit one of the big, hairy issues, surveillance and lawful intercept. I'd now like to turn to the audience and see if any of you have any questions for this panel. Fred Tipson, if anybody can stand up and introduce themselves and their affiliation.
Hi, Fred Tipson. I've been at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I want to ask a question. Michael referred to the various policy layers that are involved in these discussions. And I want to ask a question about whether there are priorities for government-to-government agreements in any of these other policy layers that you would identify as a priority for the United States government. But if you'll allow me, I can't help but put some perspective on this ITU success at Busan. When I worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee back in the early 80s, when I did 2 ITU treaties. I was handling treaties for the committee staff. And there were votes for approving those treaties by 98-0 probably on the Senate floor. And I think I'm the only guy who stood on the Senate floor and had any idea what people were voting on. So, the idea that these were, debated in public fora and, actively discussed, maybe Leslie remembers some of those days. And then I went to work at AT&T and was involved in ITU policy issues. And the most intense multi-stakeholder discussions were between Western Electric, Bell Laboratories, and Longlines, all within the AT&T umbrella. I mean, AT&T was the delegation under the State Department's leadership in those days. So to see this explosion of players and interests and issues and so forth, I can't imagine how the US government has successfully managed that process as successfully as I think they did in Busan, keeping the ITU in its lane, which I think is probably the best way to think about.
Thank God for email and a very good website.
Yeah, right. But let me come back to this question of, aren't there other policy layers that do call for intergovernmental agreements? Aren't there problems that can only be effectively addressed over time by reaching agreement, not in the ITU forum necessarily, but in other fora?
Sure.
Without which we will not be able to realize the best benefits of the internet.
If I can put a point on that question, so where's the next fight going to be, or the next 2 fights on some of these other issues?
Well, in the first instance, identifying what are the issues that require essentially a sovereign-to-sovereign negotiation and discussion. The government group of experts, which is the negotiations are led by my colleague Chris Painter out of the State Department, tries to address that very specific question at the UN. There are discussions at the UN Human Rights Commission led by our Human Rights Office relative to the privacy and surveillance questions in Germany and Brazil as interlocutors we discuss those questions on a government-to-government basis. There are existing, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. Those are government-led discussions and deliberations. So there are a whole host of government-led discussions and deliberations that touch on the internet and these issues. And some of them are appropriately governmental in their scope. Nonetheless, we would argue that all of them require the input and expertise of the stakeholder community, of technologists, industry. Because unlike, say, the oceans or space, the internet, what we call the internet, is man-made, it is divisible, and it is privately owned as a general rule. And it's operated by people who have a degree of expertise that is beyond ours as policymakers. So we need to know whether or not whatever it is we wish to agree upon is doable, and whether or not it's the right thing to do, and understand the full costs and implications of doing so. And that requires as much transparency and inclusion as possible of stakeholders. And we would argue that as it relates to the actual operations of networks, then that it is truly the realm of expertise and market forces, essentially, that should be involved in that process. So, yeah, I mean, and there are going to be continuing discussions about what is proper competition law relative to the internet between our colleagues in Europe and the United States, a central question of law and regulation. But there are a lot of questions like what is improper behavior in a market and what constitutes a concentrated market that are not new to the internet. Right? There are governing challenges that now have an internet component, and how you apply traditional values to a new environment, or traditional incentives and disincentives to behavior, is a complex question that regulators and policymakers are asking themselves around the world. Our first principle is don't try to fix what's not broken. Don't try to tell people how to design things. And I could go back to the misunderstanding we have here on the role of regulation and technology design. Try to focus on behavior, try to focus on incentives, and creating the right incentives, and promoting the right behavior, and punishing the actors. The internet doesn't do anything. People do things on the internet, right? So, and I think in corporations, and at the end of the day, when we go to this WSIS review plus 10, the negotiated language in 2003 and 2005 by some of our elders, and some of you are those elders.
Watch who you're calling old.
Was the intrinsic concept of a people-centered, development-oriented, inclusive information society. And I believe that was actually extremely strong and good language. It's a people-centered information society we're aiming for, not a government-centered information society, not a corporate-centered information society, a people-centered information society. And we wanted to promote development and inclusion. Those are all very good things, and I think are wholly consistent with our policy positions that we've been advocating. And so sometimes we have those fights in multilateral forums, sometimes we have them in multi-stakeholder forums, but getting it right is incredibly important, because the underlying tool is the foundation of the future of our societies and economy. Right? And it's going to take time.
Sally or Marie, do you have any predictions on where the next fight's going to be and what it will be over?
Sure. I do want to touch on a point that the ambassador made, which I think is really important. These discussions are moving into a whole range of international fora. So issues related to the online economy in the OECD and in APEC, privacy, cybersecurity, the Human Rights Council of Europe, a whole host of forums where issues related to the online environment are coming up. What is heartening about that is that those organizations have been reaching out to organizations like the Internet Society and others to try to get that sort of input. In the OECD, there's now a technical advisory component to the OECD's work. We see this also in APEC, we see it in Council of Europe and others. That creates a responsibility, though, for the technical community to step up and participate in beyond what we often consider our strict technical competence of, running code or developing standards and looking at how that technology and how things work in the policy context, and trying to help make that translation happen so that the public interest can be served by public policy. And so it has created, I think, a larger obligation on the internet technical community to be engaged and to be proactive in trying to make those points. In terms of where this is all going, it's been mentioned, the WSIS plus 10 meeting. For those of you who recall the WSIS in 2003, 2005, the major UN summit, really the first time that the internet issues jumped up onto the international diplomatic scene. And now it's being revisited, reviewing what progress has been made by the international community since 2005 in implementing the very high objectives of the WSIS. This is going to happen, though, as Leslie pointed out, in New York, not in Geneva, where in Geneva quite a bit of work has been done to create sort of an internet savvy diplomatic corps within Geneva. In New York, this is going to be a different context. It's going to be a very geopolitical discussion. This is going to happen, this WSIS review will happen in the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda that's underway in New York, which is actually a very good thing, I think, or could be a very good thing. We could be having a very good and important conversation about access, about development, about connectivity into developing countries, which is still highly relevant. It will also happen in the context of an increased interest in, by the General Assembly in online privacy matters, dealing with online surveillance. So I think we should expect those two sets of issues to converge in the WSIS review in New York, and create sort of an interesting dynamic for what the General Assembly decides to do with that. And I also think this is going to be a moment where the UN thinks about how it organizes itself in the internet space. So you have organizations, of course, the ITU just had its Plenipotentiary conference, but it's not alone in dealing with these matters. UNESCO has a particular set of responsibilities. There are roles for, I'm going to forget all my acronyms, but UNCTAD, Trade and Development. There's WIPO. There's a host, a UN Human Rights Council. There are a host of organizations dealing with different parts of this internet space from a policy perspective. So I think we're likely to see a very strong debate among governments about how the UN is going to organize itself, buttressed by this theme of access and security and privacy in the digital age. And what is the role of stakeholders, and what's the role of this multi-stakeholder system that's evolved over the last decades? It's going to be a very tricky and complicated discussion, as many things are in New York. Hopefully it's not a fight, but one never knows. But I do think it's a space where we've been very active in Geneva. We're going to have to step that up collectively in New York over the next 12 months.
So it's going to be very hard for the next couple of months to get hotel rooms in either Geneva
or
the East River. Before I go to Maria, I was going to quickly let Andrea had a couple of quick comments in response to your comments.
Thank you, Mike. It's always very hard to get hotel rooms either in Geneva or New York, so that won't make a difference. Quickly, I just want to stress that we are in complete agreement with the points made by Ambassador Sepulveda that whatever kind of decision, whether it's purely governmental or not, it is very important that there is inclusiveness and transparency of all stakeholders. And in fact, we should all make an effort to be even more inclusive than we are at the moment, because quite frankly, this discussion tend to reach out to very often to the usual suspects. And we need to make an effort to involve other constituencies as well that have no idea that these discussions are ongoing. On the specific question by our colleague, well, certainly the it is the position of the European Union that we would like more governments to sign and ratify the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. That has been our official position for a very long time. Some governments don't like certain parts of it. On substance, some governments actually like it, but since they were not at the table when it was drafted, they feel compelled not to sign it, which I think is, being undiplomatic, is a bit of a silly position, to be honest, but okay. Now, this is the official position of the EU. I will share some personal views, but I want to stress that this is not the official, or it is not necessarily the official position of the European Union. I personally think that we will soon get to a point where a discussion of some kind of global instrument on privacy will be unavoidable. And again, my personal view, I see people taking notes. Please also take note that this is not the official position of the EU, please.
It's already been tweeted.
Yes. And again, on that point, even though there might be differences between the EU and the US, I think that it's in our interest to lead those discussions. Again, whatever form that kind of global dialogue, the output of that global dialogue might be. I'm not claiming it should necessarily be a treaty. I'm not claiming that, but it's a dialogue that we need to have at a global level. And the very last point, besides the importance of privacy, is that in any case, whichever kind of discussion we have, it is very important that, and I'm sorry to repeat it, but it is a very important point for us, we need to reach out to countries which are in the middle in this moment. So Mike, I know that as a moderator it is your job to create a bit of tension, but I must say I don't think we should approach the discussion thinking about them as fights. If you go to a room with your boxing gloves on, the reaction you will get is very different than if you go without. So that's language is important in this, but that's my job, not yours. May I have one? No, you're right. Go ahead. I was being Italian, so go ahead.
Marie, do you have a comment on where the next discussions and debates will be?
Well, I'll just add that the comment about being closer to Europe, I think it's important. Also, making a comment that technology is continuing to evolve, and cybersecurity threats are continuing to evolve. For example, when I talked with the Indians at NIST, we said that it's never static. Everything's constantly changing, and even in the world of the internet and technology, we're moving to 5G and the Internet of Things, for example. What I would also add is I wouldn't imagine that there wouldn't still be this continued interest in trying to make revenue from the ITU, so I think we're going to have to continue to watch that. Also, there's mission creep, obviously on internet governance, technical matters, resolutions like software-defined networking, ICT applications, Internet of Things. The other thing is, it'll be interesting as hopefully countries, for example, in Africa, more delegates become more involved. I think it's great what's happened with the United States and engagement in CTEL and bringing up a lot of these countries to get them more active. I think everything will continue to change. And then lastly, I would just say, from the leadership standpoint, Zhao is now the Secretary General from China. It'll be interesting what kind of vision as he moves forward in leadership, because that's going to be a different vision from Hamadan Touré. So that'll be just an interesting thing to. And I would lastly add that the U.S. should continue to do what it's been doing from a leadership standpoint, and I think continue in that and being inclusive will help us with our continued success.
Okay, thank you very much. I know we're running out of time. We've got the lightning round now. So what I'm going to do is just ask the two people with their hands up to ask their questions, and then we'll try to get a response. And then I challenge our panelists to summarize their key point in one sentence after we respond to these two questions. So, Bill? Bill Marmon. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. You've got the microphone back.
I'm a guest, Bill, so I get to go first. Tricia Paoletta, Harris Wilcher and Grannis. To tie the issues and the challenges to current events, the Sony hack and the response are obviously a terrible precedent for a nation state using cyber attacks to suppress political content, not just within their own country, but overseas, right? So is this going to make your challenges for the next year more difficult, or are you going to be in the discussions that you all are more active in, or are you able to coordinate it off to the Budapest Convention or some of the other areas, or how's this going to impact the debate?
Okay, and I'll let Bill ask his question. Exactly your question. Well, great minds think alike. It was also my next question. There's a very important meeting coming up in April in The Hague. It's the 4th annual Cyber Policy Conference, which will focus a lot on cybersecurity. And I would say to Joelle that the friends at the Dutch Embassy would probably be very excited about doing a panel discussion on this. So anyway, I have to be a little flippant. Maybe we need the ITU to issue licenses for hacking at a very high price, and that would just take care of everything. Anyway, comments? How does the latest news from about the Sony hack change the debate?
I think we don't really know yet. It's a very serious situation, and we'll be taking our lead from the NSC and from our cybersecurity experts and officials across the government. But it is a very serious situation, and I do think it will change the tenor of the debate going forward. But I'm not exactly sure how.
Other thoughts?
Yes, I think that we do not know enough about what actually happened and where the attack originated from, because we heard different versions. I will say, however, that, and with all due respect to what happened, I understand that for Sony as a corporation it was a major, major blow, and that actually means that I will not be able to see a movie that I really wanted to watch, the interview, because apparently it won't be. And I think that's actually maybe the worst effect of the attack. The fact that we are changing, well, okay, not for the movie itself, but the fact that we are changing our behavior because of a cyber attack, that is really striking to me. That is something that you would have thought only for physical attacks. The fact that cyber attacks have right to this level, I think it should change our way of thinking. However, having said that, and recognizing the economic damage for Sony, for the company, this is not the first and it won't be the last attack of this scale. And what really worries me and us is the fact that we know about this. There are many other cyber attacks which we have no idea are even happening right now. So I think that's where we had to focus a lot more in terms of preparedness and information sharing, which is a very sensitive topic. I understand it very well, but that's something that in Europe we strongly believe that we should have a more structured information sharing on this kind of situation to better prepare ourselves and also to learn from our mistakes. We know about the Sony attack because in the end the company was forced to make it public. There was no other option. But we know that many, many companies simply stay silent because they're afraid of the PR and financial effects because of the news that they were subject to an attack. This has to change. This is simply not sustainable anymore. How to do that is a different question.
Okay, so now it's time for the one tweet summary of your key points. I'm just going to go down the line from Leslie on down. Just give us your one point that you want everybody to go home with and tweet. Leslie.
Well, I'll give you 1 point, but it won't be a tweet, but it'll be brief. And it's the following. I think looking at these issues that we were discussing today as an ecosystem is quite right. I think that's exactly the way we should look at these issues. Now, within that ecosystem, looking at next year, if I could make a prediction.
You only get a sentence.
I will say that the multi-stakeholder model will come under tremendous pressure. Tremendous pressure. And as Ambassador Sepulveda said, that there's a role for multilateral, there's a role for multi-stakeholder, but I think we should be very cognizant, and you're going to be seeing a lot of developments, a lot of statements coming from countries around the world, and perhaps we can meet again exactly the same day next year. The WSIS will have been over in New York, and the European Institute could host us and say, and the title will be multi-stakeholder versus multilateral. Where are we now? I think that's going to be next year a very important conversation that I think is going to help frame many of the things that we talked about here.
Okay, Leslie, that was more like a Facebook status update. Okay, Andrea, a tweet in Italian, Latin, English, whatever you wish.
I will do that in English, and it should stay within a tweet if you don't have hashtags, but that's for you. So it's the key messages for me are dialogue, respect, being firm on our values, and joint transatlantic leadership on these issues.
Thank you. Ambassador? This guy also tweets very well, so if you're not following him, please do.
Thank you. You will also see pictures of my children. You know, I think the understanding that this is a movement and that we as policy officials, we as leaders can't do it alone, that it isn't just words. The multi-stakeholder system requires all stakeholders to participate. Otherwise, it will not work. We need your help. We need your outreach. And we need you to be the ambassadors and the champions for the movement.
Okay, Sally, I know you just started tweeting, so she's looking for followers.
Barely. I think when you engage in these discussions, it's important always to go back to your core principles. So for the Internet Society, this is about the Internet is for everyone. Yeah. So the public policy discussion in New York needs to support those principles, that outcome.
Okay, Marie, you have the last tweet.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I'd actually put this out, but I was going to say something to the effect of protecting the Internet is worth the work. In other words, the internet is everybody's issue. And I think what happens is where everyone here is talking, and basically talking about what we're doing, which seems so far away. But this internet is something that affects every single person in the world, and it's really worth all the time and effort. So it's protecting the internet is worth the work.
Okay. Well, join me in thanking our panelists, the Internet Society for blogging this, and all of you for being here.
Happy holidays.
Very good.
Happy holidays.